และให้ดนตรีฉลองกายคุณปล่อยใจด้วยความระมุนของสายลมคลายทุกปมที่มีอยู่ในใจคราวนี้ฉันกำลังลอยอยู่ในความฝัน
I'll go up, make sure you can. Go ahead. All right, just, ooh, wow, it's loud, huh? Just want to make sure you're here tonight, you know.
Oh, the air conditioner has come on.
And now the windows are open too.
Oh, that's all right. Maybe I'll leave them open for now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the national headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America. My name is John Chianchosi. I'm the Director of Public Programs. At this time, I ask that you silence your cell phones and other noise-making electronic devices. This evening's lecture is being webcast, and I welcome our friends watching through the internet. The Theosophical Society promotes study, meditation, and service. We encourage open-minded inquiry into the world religions, philosophy, science, and the arts, and we have a deep respect for the unity of all life. Our goal is to help people explore the spiritual path so as to arrive at a deeper understanding regarding the wisdom of the ages. Furthermore, we feel this wisdom is not limited to any one tradition, and we offer programs from all traditions. I invite you to take one of our program brochures, where you'll find the programs that we are offering for the rest of this year. You can also find these programs listed on our website. If you scroll down under programs, you'll see that we offer a variety of types of programs, including the Thursday lecture series, a number of events and workshops, and also retreats that are usually offered over the weekend. You will also see that we have ongoing classes and groups that run throughout the week, Monday through Friday. And also on our website, you will find an increasing number of online programs that we offer for people so that you don't actually have to come here physically. You can participate from the comfort of your own home. And they may be of interest, especially to our people or friends watching through the internet who are living in other parts of the country. The Theosophical Society is a membership organization. However, everybody is always welcome to come and make use of the center. The resources that include the library, bookshop, all the programs that we offer here are open to the public at large, and we are always happy to see people. So please come, and come often. If you have not visited the library, please come during the day and do so. It is a wonderful place. Of course, if you are in agreement with the mission of the organization and would like to support the work that we are doing, the best way to do that is to consider becoming a member. Now, this evening, as part of our Thursday lecture series, for the first time, our speaker is here for the first time. And so it's my first time hearing him speak, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I have the pleasure of introducing to you Paul Gordon Chandler, who is an Episcopal priest, an interfaith advocate, an art curator, and social entrepreneur who lived and worked in North Africa and the Middle East for many years. He is the founder of Caravan, an international movement that uses the arts to build bridges of peace between the Middle East and West. He is the author of Pilgrims of Christ on the Muslim Road, and he has just come out with his new book, In Search of a Prophet, A Spiritual Journey with Kahlil Gibran. And this evening's lecture is on that book with the same title. So please join me in welcoming Paul Chandler.
Thank you. Good evening. It's great to be here, a real privilege to be with you here this evening. And I want to thank you for coming out on a Thursday night, no less, even though I know it's a tradition here, to hear about someone that I think is one of the most profound figures to have lived in the last century, and who I also think is exceedingly important for our times today. Someone who was a prophetic voice during his own lifetime and whose words are even more timely today, Kahlil Gibran, most known in the West, probably for his book, The Prophet, that poet, artist, and mystic who comes from Lebanon of origin. Now, I grew up in Senegal, West Africa. In a Muslim majority context, I spent the first 18 years of my life there. And in Senegal, when you need wisdom or counsel, the tradition is to go and ask an elder, someone with life experience, someone with gray hair. That's mandatory. Some of you qualify in this room. And they often respond by giving you a wolof, or that's the local tribal language, wolof proverb or parable. And two wolof proverbs come to mind when I think about this journey that I've actually been on of looking more deeply into the life of Kahlil Gibran, which resulted actually in the writing of this book. The first proverb goes like this: Ndonk ma jopo ngolo chianyai. And it means this: slowly, slowly, you catch a monkey in the bush. Now, a monkey is of high value in that context. In other words, the most treasured things come to you gradually. And it really isn't possible to absorb Kahlil's life and his writings quickly. The profundity and the style of them necessitates a contemplative approach when you're looking at them, as one savors them. In Arabic, we say shwaya shwaya, little by little, relishing them as the treasures that they are. So for all of this, it's really been a long, captivating journey that I've actually been on. The second proverb, related to the monkey again, goes like this: Ala ugolo ka lex ba. All the treasures of a monkey are found in its cheeks, meaning that the deepest riches are usually found under the surface. And there's no question that all of this has been for me, if you want to put it that way, an excavation, really an exploration into the very heart of Kahlil Gibran. Sometimes something written long ago becomes seemingly even more relevant than during its own day, such as happened, for example, with George Orwell's 1984 here in the West not too long ago. And now more than ever, I think there's a need to hear voices that call us to unity and to respect, which is very much what you're about here, and to be inspired to live deeply and generously in our thinking and actions toward the other, whomever the other is. And I believe Kahlil Gibran is just that voice, and his profound insights offer our day much-needed guidance and wisdom. All of this started for me when I was working on a previous book that was focused on Christian-Muslim relations. I was looking at the life of a Syrian writer named Mazhar Malouhi, who was this profound bridge between East and West. And in that, as I traveled throughout the Middle East and North Africa, I discovered really how much Gibran was loved by both the Middle East and the West. The East was proud of him, and the West admired him. He was very much this uniting figure. And it intrigued me actually to look more deeply into his life, not just into his life and work, though, but actually almost more into his inner spiritual journey, his formation. And in so doing, I came to discover that Gibran is really a supreme East-West figure. And as a result is this unparalleled guide for our times related to peace, related to harmony, related to building bridges between East and West, certainly between their creeds and cultures. And his life and his approach, action, work actually touches almost on most of the major critical issues of our day. For example, yes, bridging between East and West, cultures and creeds, women's equality, care for the environment, interest in spirituality as opposed to institutional religion, status of refugees, immigration, Syria and the conflict in the Middle East, inclusive embrace of different faiths and learning from the best in each tradition, and of course that ongoing hunger that touches on a spiritual depth that we also desire for ourselves. On the crisis in Syria during his time, he wrote, "My heart burns for Syria. Fate has been most cruel to her. Her gods are dead. Her children left her to seek bread in faraway lands. And yet she's still alive. And that is the most painful thing." Could have been written yesterday. As it was said about Ibn al-Arabi, the 13th century Arab Sufi poet and mystic and scholar, he is a man for our time, for he has his foot in every camp. And because many excellent biographies had been written about Kahlil, I instead wanted to delve more deeply into his inner spiritual formation and immerse myself in his writings and the environments actually that shaped him. And specifically, I sought to understand what led him from being born as someone who into at that time was an exclusive and sectarian and intolerant Christian community to becoming someone who actually ended up embracing all in our world, and as a result is often embraced by all. Took me all over the world, to museums, art galleries, churches, mosques, through revolutions, through counter-revolutions. It first involved, over the course of several years, visiting all the places that he lived and taking Kahlil with me, so to speak, meaning his writings, reading them in the order that he wrote them, in the places that he wrote them at each respective phase of his life. It also led me to the far-reaching places of influence his writings and art have reached. I began in his birthplace of Bishari, a little village up in the snowy mountains of Lebanon, and then on to Boston, where he and his family immigrated, and then to Paris, where he did his art training, and then to New York, where he spent most of his career, ending up in Mexico City, of all places, at the spectacular Museo Sumaya, which holds the largest collection of Kahlil's art and writings in the Western Hemisphere. And so many places in between, such as Cairo, Egypt, where most of his writings in Arabic in the Middle East were first published, to Savannah, Georgia, at the Telfair Museums that hold the largest collection of his work in the United States, to Detroit, in that area, to the Arab American National Museum that focuses on his legacy, and so many places in between where monuments and streets and schools and parks are named after him. It didn't take me long to realize I knew a lot less about Kahlil than I had imagined. I knew he was Lebanese. I knew he was of Christian background, though I must admit when I was younger, I actually thought he was of Muslim background. I knew that he lived in the early 1900s. And of course, I knew he had written the best-selling book of spiritual prose poetry, The Prophet. However, what I didn't know was far greater. I didn't know that Kahlil is one of the most widely read poets in history, behind only Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. I didn't know that Elvis Presley was one of his greatest fans and gave away thousands of copies of The Prophet, had completely memorized it, and was able to recite it at a moment's notice. One of his last big ambitious plans before he died, Elvis, was to make a film of the book, The Prophet. I didn't know that the singer Johnny Cash was equally captivated by Kahlil's writings and message. I didn't know that he was a friend of the Teddy Roosevelt family. I didn't know that he was sought out by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats to have his portrait drawn by him, and that Yeats's wife loved it so much that she begged Kahlil to do one of her as well. I didn't know that he knew and drew the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and the Indian Nobel Prize laureate Rabindranath Tagore. I didn't know that he met Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor, when he was studying art in France, and while he was in Paris, some of the great Impressionist artists were still around: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Mary Cassatt. Picasso, young as he was there at that time. And even Marc Chagall moved to Paris when Kahlil was living there. I didn't know that the morning after the Titanic sank, when he had obviously been troubled and had trouble and difficulty sleeping, he struggled to know if he should cancel his appointment to draw the portrait of the leader of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Baha. He decided to go ahead with the sitting, and he was deeply moved by Abdu'l-Baha's calming presence. I didn't know that during the height of the American prohibition on alcohol, Kahlil, with his proclivity to arak, that strong Levantine anise-flavored alcoholic drink, was able, almost miraculously, to secure this continuing flowing stash of the contraband. I didn't know that Queen Noor was influenced by Kahlil's life at a young age and his work, and is an avid promoter of his writings. I didn't know that the actors Salma Hayek and Liam Neeson were as well. I didn't know that Kahlil was almost excommunicated by his own Maronite Catholic Church as a heretic for his strong attacks early on against religious hypocrisy that he saw in it. And yet at his funeral at the very end, at the cathedral in Beirut, he was honored by the Maronite Patriarch and all the church authorities in Lebanon, as well as leaders from other faiths around the world. I didn't know that Kahlil's writings were instrumental in sparking a reformation and a renaissance of sorts in Arabic literature, as he broke with the rigid Arabic literary canons of his day, and actually his genre of prose poetry created a new genre in Arabic literature. I didn't realize that when Kahlil was how he's most known in the West for the Prophet, most Arabs in the Middle East don't even think of the book The Prophet when they think of him, but they know him for their parables, his parables and short stories and essay articles. I didn't realize that he was seen as a political revolutionary early on in his career, speaking out through his writings against the injustices of the Ottoman administration and their occupation in Lebanon, which was termed Syria then, calling on his fellow countrymen to rise up to free themselves from the oppressive yoke. I didn't know that one of the wealthiest men in the world, Carlos Slim, a Mexican of Lebanese heritage, has one of the largest collections of Kahlil's writings and art in the world in Mexico City. I didn't know that one of President John F. Kennedy's most famous quotes was taken from an article that Kahlil wrote in Arabic to his own countrymen: "Ask not what this country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I had no idea of the scope of his influence worldwide, both in terms of his reach geographically as to the diversity of the breadths of groups that identify with him. I remember seeing in Timbuktu, Mali once, up in the Sahara Desert. I was in a home of a Tuareg friend. The Tuaregs were those nomadic blue men. Some of you have seen them in National Geographic. And there in this mud brick home without almost hardly any furniture, there's a little French version of the Prophet. In Timbuktu, no less. And he seems to be claimed by every group and circle imaginable. Kahlil the poet, Kahlil the novelist, Kahlil the essayist, the activist, the revolutionary, the counterculturalist, the philosopher, the artist, the painter, Kahlil the modernizer of Arabic literature, Kahlil the prophet, Kahlil the New Age guru, Kahlil the visionary, Kahlil the humanitarian, Kahlil the Sufi, Kahlil the Christian, Kahlil the universalist, Kahlil the interfaith mentor, and the list goes on. He is an enigma. And it begs the question, will the real Kahlil Gibran please stand up? The renowned contemporary Syrian poet Adonis summed it up perfectly when he spoke about Kahlil. He's a star spinning outside the orbit of that other sun in his universal acceptance. One of Kahlil's contemporary biographers, the Lebanese Alexander Najjar, captures the paradoxical nature of Kahlil in these words. He's the most famous stranger on earth, a name without a face, a legend, a writer without a legend, an Arab writing in English, a Lebanese from the mountains who forged his way in exile, but who found freedom and rediscovered an excessive passion for his homeland. He's a reader of the Bible, talking like a Sufi, a Christian who cherishes the glory of Islam, a lover of mature women who seeks the purity of his soul in the reflection of his works. Kahlil's older friend and fellow writer, Amin Rehani, whose portrait by Kahlil is actually the one I used on the cover of this book, said of him, "Through Arabic he conquered our minds, and through English he conquered our hearts." Kahlil Gibran was born in 1883 into a Maronite Christian family, high up in the mountains of Lebanon, in the Kadisha Valley, what is known as the Sacred Valley. It's a beautiful region. It's a place that has sheltered its people for centuries during various invasions. It resounds with majestic natural beauty. It had an important and lasting influence on Kahlil. In contrast to the gorgeous, peaceful surroundings, Kahlil was born into a period of political and interreligious strife, as well as one full of corruption by the religious authorities during the latter part of a 400-year-long Ottoman occupation. These were all circumstances that would greatly influence his life and work for years to come. He was a quiet, creative child, and his mother stood out as a caring and an empowering presence in his life. And sensing his unique creative talents and spiritual sensitivity, she sought to encourage him and at one point secured a book of Leonardo da Vinci's artwork to give him as a gift, which Kahlil remembered as a pivotal moment in that early period of his life. He wrote of the experience, "I'll never forget the moment as long as I live. It was as if a ship lost in the fog had suddenly found a compass." His grandfather had been a Maronite priest, and thanks to his mother, he was taught the great epic biblical stories which captured his imagination at a young age and showed up again as imagery throughout his writings for the rest of his life. Kahlil's father, though, was not so reliable, prone to drink, with gambling debts. He was accused of embezzlement while working for a local Ottoman administrator, and he was sent to prison, and all the family's property was lost. His mother eventually decided to follow her relatives to America and emigrated with Kahlil's older half-brother and 2 younger sisters just before he entered his teenage years. And although Kahlil was able to spend only 12 short years of his life in that mountainous setting, it was to serve as the foundation of his spirituality and worldview for the rest of his life. Once in America, they settled into Boston's South End, which was called like a little Syria then, and Kahlil began to learn English, and a whole new world of artistic influences began to inspire him. As a young teenager, he met the avant-garde Bostonian photographer and publisher Fred Holland Day, who was equally intrigued with Kahlil, and Day introduced him to this vast world of literature and art and encouraged his artistic ability. Concerned that Kahlil was losing his Arab culture and values, his mother, looking on, decided to send him back to Lebanon to complete his high school education under the watchful care of the Maronite Catholic Church in Beirut. And then the story unfolds from there. Upon his return to Boston, and within an 18-month period, he lost one of his sisters and his half-brother to tuberculosis, and then his mother to cancer. After a devastating fire that destroyed pretty much all of his artwork to date, he began to write more intensely and began to be involved in the world of Arab immigrant writers at that time in Boston, contributing articles and essays to Arabic language newspapers, publishing books for an Arabic language imprint, and helping to organize a group of writers that met regularly to discuss modern Arabic literature. And he began to express his feelings through outspoken, some might say scorching articles in Arabic newspapers in the U.S., and books and magazines, because as an immigrant, he discovered that he actually had the liberty to write in a way that he would never be allowed to write had he been living in the Arab world at that time. And with boldness and without repercussions, he crafted stories and articles addressing highly sensitive themes. He began to call on his Lebanese people to question ideologies as he began himself to grapple with religion and spirituality. He spoke out in his articles against the oppression by the Ottomans and was concerned by the sectarian strife that was more often than not fueled by religious authorities in his country and their hypocrisy. And he also became very concerned with women's rights. And for the next 10 years, 1903 to 1913, from the age of 20 to 30, Kahlil would seek to balance the push and pull of these 2 linguistic and artistic worlds as he found himself poised at a confluence of cross-currents between the East and West. Determined to tear down walls of injustice, he eventually found himself threatened with excommunication from authorities in the Maronite Catholic Church of his upbringing. He had completed his brilliant work, some of you have perhaps read it, titled Spirits Rebellious, in which one of the short stories in there is titled Kahlil the Heretic, and a blast in it the hypocrisy of religious corruption and oppression of the weak and vulnerable at that time. Not surprisingly, not too long after this, while in Paris, representatives from the Patriarch in Lebanon who were visiting France at that time, they asked to see him. They wanted to put him in line. And he related the encounter quite lightheartedly to a friend who recorded it in her journal. She wrote of the experience. One bishop had a sense of humor, the other none. Non-humorists took him aside and said, "You have made a grave mistake and are making a grave mistake. Your gifts you are using against your people, against your country, against your church. The Holy Patriarch realizes this, and now seek out every copy of the book, destroy them all, and let me take word back to you, from you to Syria and the church and to the Holy Patriarch." Well, as you can imagine, this exchange only spurred Kahlil on further. He actually saw himself at that time somewhat as a revolutionary, as a rebel, writing that life without rebellion is like the seasons without spring. And he was an advocate for freedom within and without. Kahlil wrote to his cousin in Brazil, "The people in Syria are calling me a heretic, and the intelligentsia in Egypt vilifies me, saying he's the enemy of just laws, of family ties, and of old traditions." Those writers are actually telling the truth, because I do not love man-made laws, and I abhor the traditions that our ancestors left us. And this hatred of mine is the fruit of my love for the sacred and spiritual kindness that should be the source of every law upon the earth, for kindness is the shadow of God in man. Through his Arabic novella titled Broken Wings, he became an advocate for women, well ahead of his time. He had this incredibly high view of women, whether friend or stranger or lover or sister or mother, and he consistently fused his admiration for them into the essence of his painting and writing. It's especially noteworthy considering the very patriarchal society of his childhood, and also the time period here in America in which he was immersed as women were in the thick of the fight for the right to vote. Even his view of God echoed these convictions of gender equality and pushed the boundaries of the accepted norm at that time. He wrote, "Most religions speak of God in the masculine gender. God is to me as much mother as God is father. God is both father and mother in one." However, albeit early on considering himself more of an activist, over time, as he often wrote about this process of growing into our greater selves, he matures into someone, you see, who with this graciousness that reached across all divides of humanity and all-embracing spirituality, one that built bridges of peace. You'd have to say he also increasingly became an artistic contemplative, using his many creative gifts to communicate his insights. And regarding his art and writing, one supported the other. When asked which he preferred, he refused to separate them, responding with the impossibility of choosing a favorite child. At a very crucial time in his development, his lifelong friend and patron, Mary Haskell, appeared in a supportive role that put him on a course that allowed him to pursue and cultivate his many creative gifts. She eventually funded those 2 years of education, art education in Paris, to allow him to master the fundamentals, and from that experience he was able to discover and cultivate his own unique style that the world now knows him for. After his time in Paris, he moved to New York City, and he continued to publish works in Arabic and exhibited his artwork at a few very significant galleries. And then in 1918, his first book in English, written in English, was published, titled The Madman. And it was quickly followed by a second book in English titled The Forerunner. And by 1923, his third book in English, and this is what it looked like, The Prophet, quickly gained worldwide attention. He also worked on his longest English book, Jesus, the Son of Man, for much of his adult life, seeking to return the Jesus that he felt had been disfigured in the West back to his Middle Eastern origins, publishing that creative masterwork just 3 years before he died at the age of 48. The more I studied of Kahlil's fascinating life, the more intrigued I became with his inward journey. More than anything else, it was evident that his life was lived toward a deeper dimension. He was a natural mystic who simply sought to build bridges and tear down walls. His voice is timeless, appealing to heart and mind, faith and reason, a guiding spirit at a time when stereotypes and misunderstandings are, we all know this all too well, are increasing, ever-widening divides. And he so powerfully, as he so powerfully wrote, "I believe in the book, capital B, that makes us all brothers and sisters equal before the sun. I believe in the teachings that set free you and me from any type of bondage and place us unfettered upon the earth, which is the stepping place of the feet of God." Certainly heeding his wisdom would go a long way toward healing our world. And in this regard, there seem to be two overarching themes, I think, to Kahlil's life and work. The best analogy I can think of is that of a river. It's one actually that he used a lot, but a river flowing deep and wide. As Kahlil plumbed the depths of his inner life, he went to the core of human existence. He was forever exploring the deepest of life's questions. On the purpose of being, he writes, spiritual awakening is the most essential thing in life, and it is the sole purpose of being. He who does not befriend his soul is an enemy of humanity. Life emerges from within. He described himself as going into the silence, intentionally so. He wrote, only when you drink of the river of silence shall you indeed sing. He even named his New York studio the Hermitage, decorating it sparsely in a manner that created a contemplative atmosphere for him. A simple wooden bed, several crucifixes of wood and metal, a small brass chalice, an easel, a tapestry of a Middle Eastern Jesus hung on a wall above an altar-like table with brass candlesticks. I love Kahlil's short story called The Tempest. It's infused with the imagery of the Hermitage in his childhood village in Lebanon, now the place actually where he's buried. He tells the story of a young man who is roaming the cedar forest in the mountains one autumn afternoon, and he's caught in a terrible rainstorm. He seeks cover in an isolated shelter inhabited by a hermit, Yusuf al-Fakri. And he's heard of Yusuf from the local villagers and had longed to meet him one day to learn his spiritual secrets. And this storm provides him the perfect excuse. And when the young man is welcomed into Yusuf's shelter, he notices that the old man is tending to a bird with broken wings. Symbolism abounds here. The old hermit engages in conversation and slowly imparts his wisdom through all this beautiful imagery. He shares that he left the world to live in the awakeness of life and to think upon the compelling and beautiful mystery of existence. I came to this far corner of God's domain, for I hungered to learn the secrets of the universe and approach close to the throne of God. And as the climax of the story is reached, the hermit leaves the man in the shelter and goes out in the hermitage there and walks out into the height of the storm, saying to that young man, I'm now going to walk through the night with the tempest. It is a practice I enjoy greatly. I hope you will teach yourself to love the tempest. Kahlil consistently succeeded at crafting poetic invitations to journey toward the depths of oneself, exploring that rich reservoir within. In another reflection, he notes, God has placed in each soul an apostle to lead us upon an illumined path. Yet many seek life from without, unaware that it is within them. When someone asked him what is a mystic, Kahlil said to have smiled and replied, nothing very secret nor formidable, just someone who has drawn aside one more veil. Kahlil was constantly listening, paying attention to life, and ever in search of greater interior depth. The soul is mightier than space, he said, stronger than time, deeper than the sea, and higher than the stars. He was preoccupied during his entire life with the depths that he knew the spirit of humanity was able to plumb and the heights that he was convinced humanity was destined to scale, always striving toward a deeper dimension. Kahlil spoke of his painting process in similar terms to his friend and patron, Mary Haskell. When I paint a picture, I try to give the picture a presence. It's the coming together of certain elements in a certain way as if they made a sort of path which God can come through to our consciousness. Another time he wrote to her, I have obtained a first-rate telescope, and I spend an hour or two every evening staring into infinity, close to that which is distant and remote, and in awe of the greater whole. He saw depth everywhere. The collection of imagery and created synonyms Kahlil used for God are many: the greater whole, the infinite, the almighty, God creator, nature, love, eternal wisdom, unseen, eternal altar, all-powerful, supreme infinite, Lord of life, of love, and of death, great spirit, great intelligent being, great power, the unknown, the great sea, the absolute, and the list goes on. Of Kahlil's belief in God, his contemporary Lebanese biographer Alexander Najjar writes, "What kind of God did Gibran believe in? His view of God was not mainstream. Gibran's mysticism is a convergence of several different influences: Christianity, Islam, Sufism, Theosophy, and Jungian psychology. He was a native of Lebanon, which, contrary to appearances, represented religious syncretism. It was a message of coexistence that he offered. He rejected fanaticism and religious segregation of any kind and culled his own convictions from a synthesis of different religious messages without their dogmatism. He could not reasonably confine himself to any one of the three great monotheistic faiths." Over and over again, Kahlil focused in his work on love for God rather than religion. When asked, "What is religion?" he replied, "What is it? I know only life. Life means the field, the vineyard, and the loom. The church is within you, and you yourself are your priest." During a time of deep despair and questioning, he wrote, "But somehow when I feel like a little helpless fish in a muddy lake, I cannot help but say to myself, the air which is above the water is not muddy. I cannot lose my faith in the God element." And in a time, and I think when it becomes harder and harder to listen to our inner selves, our souls, however you may term that, or even what we may need spiritually, I think Kahlil exemplifies someone who journeyed intentionally inward, creating room for silence to listen to the quiet nudgings of his soul, and intent on allowing both the highs and low moments of life to weave together into one voice. And it's that voice within a voice that Kahlil wanted his readers to hear when reading his writings. As his good friend, the eminent American architect and writer Claude Bragdon, who actually was the architect for this building, the Rogers Building, said of Kahlil, "His power came from some great reservoir of spiritual life, else it could not have been so universal and so potent. But the majesty and the beauty of the language with which he clothed it were all his own." This depth is what I think led the actor Salma Hayek actually to produce a film on Kahlil's book, The Prophet. One of the most enjoyable trips that I went on working on this book was to attend the premiere of The Prophet, this animated adaptation of the book, at the Toronto International Film Festival, produced by Salma Hayek and directed by Roger Ayers, most known for The Lion King. The film was a visual extravaganza. Perhaps some of you have seen it, with animated chapters from award-winning animation directors from all over the world and beautiful music from world-class musicians and singers and composers from Yo-Yo Ma to Gabriel Yared. It was a deeply moving experience. In fact, it's the only time, with the exception of the film Gandhi, that I've observed such reverent silence at the end of a film. No one in this diverse audience from all over the world moved or said a thing. At the after party, I had the opportunity of speaking with Salma about her inspiration in producing the film. And with her contagious exuberance, she shared about her own connection to the Prophet through her Lebanese grandfather, whom she adored and who she remembers always kept a copy of the Prophet on his nightstand, his bedstand. As a young adult, she read the Prophet herself and was profoundly moved. She told us, "I found out that there are millions of people around the world who have shared the same kind of connection to this book, in which the words of Kahlil have so strongly impacted them positively and spiritually. And when you read this book, something really strange happens inside you. Your soul recognizes it as truth." And she went on to tell us that that's why she made the film. She said, "I thought it was crucial that we pay further tribute to this man who was an Arab and who wrote a book of spiritual philosophy that unites all religions in all countries and all creeds for many generations." And in those comments, I believe that Salma really captured the essence of Kahlil's spiritual journey. Because the deeper he went, the wider, actually, his embrace became. The depth of Kahlil's spiritual journey led to this extraordinary breadth of spirit in which he experienced the oneness of humanity. The reservoirs he cultivated in the deep gave him the capacity to actually go wide. Arising from his internalized bridging of the Eastern and Western influence in his life, this faith emerged over time that transcended all cultures and religions. Addressing his fellow Arabs in the Middle East, he wrote, "Humans are divided into different clans and tribes and belong to countries and towns. But I find myself belonging a stranger to all communities and belong to no settlement. The universe is my country, and the human family is my tribe. Thou art my brother and sister because you are human, and we are all children of one Holy Spirit. We are equal and made of the same earth." He went beyond religion to the core of universal spirituality. Historically, both in the Middle East and West, especially at that time, individuals made distinctions between Christian and Muslim civilization. Kahlil saw only one civilization, and his beliefs cut through divides, reaching across to the other. As Kahlil so powerfully said, your neighbor is your other self, dwelling behind a wall. In understanding, all walls fall down. He recognized, of course, the necessity of borders and nations, and yet he strove toward a borderless citizenship that transcended geography. I love the way he expressed his collective embrace of humanity with that poetic visual imagery of a cloud. He wrote, "Should you sit upon a cloud, you would not see the boundary line between one country and another, nor the boundary stone between a farm and a farm. It's a pity you cannot sit upon a cloud." Just before the onset of World War I, Kahlil wrote an essay titled "An Open Letter from a Christian Poet to Muslims." And in it, he referred to himself as a Christian who placed Jesus in one half of his heart and Muhammad in the other. Kahlil's ever-embracing spirituality continued to mature and was expressed thoughtfully in a collection of aphorisms in English titled "Sand and Foam." In it, he wrote, "Should you really open your eyes and see, you would behold your image in all images. And should you open your ears and listen, you would hear your own voice in all voices." Words that continue, of course, to echo and inspire. And touching on the most sensitive topic of all in the Middle East, religion, he does so by looking at the nature of God. "You are my brother and sister, and I love you. I love you worshiping in your church, or kneeling in your temple, or praying in your mosque. You and I are all children of one religion, for the varied paths of religion are but the fingers of the loving hand of the Supreme Being, extended to all, offering completeness of spirit to all, and anxious to receive all." Finding a way to powerfully communicate a non-sectarian version of spirituality was something that weighed heavily on Kahlil. And consequently, he felt that all the events of his life seemed to lead him toward the creation of his most well-known book, The Prophet. Of the Prophet, he wrote, "It's the biggest challenge of my life. My entire being is in the Prophet. Everything I've ever done before was only a prelude to this." And he felt a sense almost of sacred responsibility when he was writing it, almost as if it was a holy book. Even the process of writing it was a period of kind of spiritual rebirth for him. And embodying East and West, it speaks to people from all religions. It prompted his friend and patron and sometimes editor Mary Haskell to remark upon first receiving a copy of it after its release, "It's the most loving book ever written." The Prophet actually made its literary debut at a public reading at a church in Manhattan, St. Mark's in the Bowery. It's the oldest site of continuous religious practice in New York, and Kahlil knew the then rector at that time, William Norman Guthrie, a close friend of Frank Lloyd Wright. Guthrie invited Kahlil to exhibit some paintings in there, and then when The Prophet came out, when it was published, he arranged for its first public reading by a well-known actor at that time, Butler Davenport. Kahlil was there. It was standing room only. And afterwards he commented, "I wanted it first read in a church." Interestingly, as Kahlil continued to journey spiritually, he sought to sift through his own religious upbringing, through all the baggage, all the trappings, all the traditions that accumulated around it over the centuries, over the millennia. Just as the Dalai Lama is said to have encouraged the Trappist monk and writer Thomas Merton, who was fascinated with Buddhism, to not convert to Buddhism, but rather to go deeply to his own tradition and find its core essence, Kahlil in some ways finds himself doing the same thing. And in that, he discovers the figure of Jesus, actually, in a new way. He came to see Jesus as a person far beyond Christianity, and instead more as a universal sage for all humanity. In Jesus, he saw this all-embracing figure, and he was enraptured by his character. He wrote, "His life is the symbol of humanity. He shall always be the supreme figure for all ages." One of my favorite little vignettes, and this says a lot about where he was in his own spiritual life regarding to his Christian background, is about Jesus of history meeting the Jesus of a religion, Christianity, that grew up around him. Once every 100 years, Jesus of Nazareth meets Jesus of the Christian in a garden among the hills of Lebanon. And they talk long. And each time Jesus of Nazareth goes away saying to Jesus of the Christian, "My friend, I fear we shall never, never agree." Observing the corruption and inequalities and sectarian power plays of the church in Lebanon as a young man, he was naturally drawn to the radical aspect of Jesus' all-embracing, inclusive love and the strength of his humility, the antithesis of everything he saw in the Christian tradition that was around him. He considered Jesus to be the greatest of all artists and poets, the master poet who makes poets of us all. He also pictured Jesus as a fellow Middle Easterner, which he was, of course, and he felt this deep personal cultural connection to him, and hence the opportunity to write about his life became this ever-increasing aspiration. His longest and last book, Jesus the Son of Man, written before his death, 3 years before his death, and some see it as a sort of fifth gospel. And in it, if you read it through, it's one of the most beautiful pieces of literature that he's written. He presents this mesmerizing picture of Jesus. He portrays the life of Jesus through the eyes and voices of 77 individuals during the time of Jesus, historical and some purely fictional, some friends and some antagonists. Although he spoke a lot about God, his writings and art were infused with a much deeper concern, that of living in harmony with one another and all of creation. He wrote, "I bid you to speak not so freely of God, who is your all, but to speak rather to and understand one another, neighbor unto neighbor." And understanding and empathy emanated from his person, ideals, of course, that are so necessary in our contemporary context. Also, to Kahlil, while spirituality served as an attempt to connect with the transcendent, the divine, however you want to term it, he realized this could not be found in creeds and dogma, and so to search for God solely in a mosque or a church or a temple was actually to limit one's search for wholeness. So his quest became an opportunity to actually unearth that which was woven in the very fabric of creation, of the environment, of nature. And in an age in which issues in our environment are at the forefront, with deep respect for the earth, Kahlil's holistic worldview very much rings forth. He did not separate the spiritual dimension of life from the natural world as the West so often has done, unlike the East, but rather, of course, he saw them in harmony. Just after Easter 1931, after a battle with ill health, Kahlil lay dying. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, the same hospital that had received survivors of the Titanic disaster for treatment, and then was used again to treat victims of the September 11 attack. At age 48, with cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung, Kahlil slipped from this world into a realm he believed would be an endless dawn, forever the first day. The breadth of diversity and the outpouring of appreciation for his life says it all, reaching across all religious and cultural divides. In New York, it was actually a rabbi who had known Kahlil from his early days in the U.S. that undertook the task of arranging a tribute, titled a tribute to the spirit of Kahlil Gibran. It was a mosaic of diversity, with leaders of numerous faith traditions praising his life: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Theosophist. As requested in his will, his body made his pilgrimage all the way back to Lebanon, accompanied by his sister Mariana. Upon arriving by ship in Beirut, the coffin was opened and he was posthumously awarded the Declaration of Fine Arts Medallion by the Ministry of Education for his life's work. Then, led by governmental dignitaries, French military officers, diplomats from all over the world, and leaders from Christian, Muslim, Druze, and Jewish communities, along with thousands of school children, the entourage processed past many, many thousands of admirers who lined the streets until they reached the Maronite Catholic Cathedral, where his body was then blessed by the Archbishop. Once thought of as a rebel by the church and by his country, in the end he was welcomed home as a celebrated native son. In the tribute to Kahlil, the day or two after this, that was held in Beirut's Grand Theater, the president of Lebanon, renowned writers and poets, representatives from the Islamic, Christian, and Druze communities, all reflected on Kahlil's spirituality and his universal appeal. A Christian said there, one of the well-known writers in Lebanon at that time, he was a Sufi sage for all humanity. Then the procession went on foot. It made the 50-mile journey from Beirut up to his home village of Bishari up in the mountains, all the way lined with people. The procession stopped 20 different times for local ceremonies. Then he was eventually laid to rest, as he had requested, in the hermitage grotto of his childhood, high up in the mountains of his beloved cedar trees, which is now part of the Gibran Museum. More than ever, Kahlil's own words rang true, for in one soul are contained the hopes and feelings of all mankind. One of my favorite allegories by Kahlil is titled The River. It's frequently read at funerals and memorial services, and it's reminiscent of Longfellow's Hiawatha, that poem. It's set in his beloved Kadisha Valley, the sacred valley, and visually highlights Kahlil's life journey, one mixed with both joy and suffering, but which always led to that deeper realm. The river. In the valley where the mighty river flows, two little streams met and spoke to one another. One stream said, "How came you, my friend, and how was your path?" And the other answered, "My path was encumbered. The wheel of the mill was broken, and the master farmer who used to conduct me from my channel to his plants is dead. I struggled down, oozing with the waste of those who do not but sit and bake their laziness in the sun. But how was your path, my brother?" And the other stream answered and said, "Mine was a different path. I came down the hills among fragrant flowers and shy willows. Men and women drank of me with silvery cups, and little children paddled their rosy feet at my edges. And there was laughter all about me, and there were sweet songs. What a pity that your path was not so happy." At that moment, the river spoke with a loud voice and said to the streams, come in, we are going to the sea. Come in, speak no more. Be with me now, we are going to the sea. Come in, for in me you shall forget your wanderings, sad or joyful. Come in, and you and I will forget all our ways when we reach the heart of our mother, the sea. Kahlil's life journey of depth and breadth can't help but challenge us all. His words continue to reverberate in hearts and souls, stirring the reader, the hearer, whoever he or she may be, to journey toward that deeper dimension. And he reminds us that it's actually time to proactively reach across divides that surround us and break down walls of inequality and injustice. It's time to build bridges in whatever ways we can conceive and to seek peaceful resolutions. It's time to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. It's time to unite and see our own reflections in the faces of others. It's time to find a way to carve out room for quiet and respect for the environment. It's time to delve deeper in our own traditions, past outward imperfections and trappings to to the very core of life. In one final vignette from Kahlil, his words inspire and challenge us towards our greater selves. It's titled, "Set a sheet of snow-white paper." Set a sheet of snow-white paper. Pure was I created, and pure will I remain forever. I would rather be burnt and turned to white ashes than suffer darkness to touch me, nor the unclean to come near me. The ink bottle heard the paper, what it was saying, and it laughed in its dark heart, but it never dared to approach her. And the multicolored pencils heard her also, but they too never came near her. And the snow-white sheet of paper did remain pure and chaste forever. Pure and chaste and empty. I close with the moving words of Kahlil's good friend Mikhail Naimi, who wrote the first biography on him just 3 years after his death. For some purpose unknown to you and to me, Gibran was born in Lebanon at the time he was born. And for a reason hidden from you and me, Arabic was his mother tongue. It would seem that the all-seeing eye perceived our spiritual drought and sent us this rain-bearing cloud to drizzle some relief to our parching souls. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was beautiful. And now we do have time for questions. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone so that we can record the question as well as the answer.
You happen to mention that this picture is not
It's not
Kahlil.
Gibran. It's
Is that
actually Gibran drew it. It's of his best friend, Amin Rehani. Yeah. And we chose it, or the publisher is involved, of course, because that looks pretty prophet-like, doesn't it? Is there one of his? There, in the book there are, yeah, very much. Photos and drawings and self-portraits, yeah.
I was really moved by your talk, actually. Even though you are saying in sentences, it sounded like music to me. It's amazing work. I mean, it's, whatever the research you did, but the way you said, you have magic in it. I appreciate that very much. I was very touched by one of the example you said, when we sit on the cloud, we don't see the borders. It is pity that you can't sit on the cloud. That reminded me of one of the mystic said is, there are two forces in us working, one towards the grace upwards, one towards the gravity downwards. So that's why probably we can't sit on the cloud, because our gravity is pulling too hard.
We're too heavy, huh?
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think in many ways that's what Gibran meant, of encouraging us toward our greater selves. It was removing that weight, actually.
I'm curious, what is it that drew you to Kahlil Gibran, and why take on this incredible work that you've just done?
Okay, right. I grew up in a context as a Christian minority within a Muslim majority context. And so very early on, I began to see some of the tensions that exist between the two. And yet as young people, there were no tensions. And I remember always thinking there has to be another way. So a lot of my own journey in life has been finding those ways, creative ways, to build those bridges with the other. And which, of course, you know, causes some tension in certain communities that you come from, you know, as well, of course. And I found in Gibran someone that in so many ways resonated with how I was personally developing and journeying. And the more I got into him, the more I would stand back and wonder in awe. It's like this endless, rich reservoir that the deeper you go, it keeps getting deeper, it feels like, you know. And I also thought he provided a lot of fresh perspective on my own faith tradition. Because he very much saw Jesus as one who was trying to reform, in some ways, religion in the context he was in, not about starting a whole new faith, religion. And so he kind of goes back to the core essence, and that attracted me too, you know. So.
I kind of missed on one thing that you said, something about Rabindranath Tagore and him.
Rabindranath Tagore, yes.
Yeah. Did you say he was influenced by him, or Rabindranath Tagore was influenced by him?
Well, maybe they influenced each other in terms of friendship. They knew each other. 2 times when Tagore came to the United States, he saw him. He drew him as a portrait, quite a profound, beautiful portrait. Gibran became known. Gibran was a little bit more, Tagore was more famous than Gibran at that time, but as Gibran became more known, he increasingly was called the Tagore of the Middle East. So.
Because one of the poetries in Shraddhanjali is where the mind is without fear.
Yeah, and he loved that, by the way.
Yeah,
yes.
And something to that essence that you talked about, where the world is not broken up into narrow, fragmented walls.
There's a beautiful passage in a letter that he wrote where when he first read that and how he gravitated very much to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
So beautifully said. Incredible personality. I don't know much about him. I'm curious, though, what you think, and maybe it's not a very serious question. How would you explain his alcoholism in the context of his life and everything that it represents? Just a curiosity question.
On a humorous side, if you've tasted arak, okay? No, I'm just, it's an acquired taste. Wine, yeah, this is an acquired taste. I think one of the things about, and of course he died, part of the reason he died was cirrhosis of the liver. I think one of the beautiful things about Gibran is it's impossible to understand him without understanding that he suffered greatly. It's that, and he loved Blake. He was drawn to Blake, William Blake, the 18th century English poet, mystic artist. Blake has those wonderful lines that Gibran loved. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. And I think that in many ways describes Gibran's journey. One of the things I find him attractive as well is that he wasn't a saint. Well, of course, we know no one's really a saint, but and it's interesting, some early biographies tried to portray him as this man who, you know, like that last little vignette I read, white paper, not being touched by anything. Well, that wasn't Gibran. He was someone who was accessible, you can relate to. But regardless, he was on this thread, there's this golden thread of that inward journey and connecting with the transcendent. And it led him, I mean, the beautiful thing is it kept leading him to become this figure that more and more people loved and were attracted to because he became more accepting and embracing of everyone. So anyway, but that's why he died at 48, one of the reasons. You know, of course, tuberculosis, his brother, half-brother and sister died of tuberculosis as well. So that was another element, but he was probably weakened enough for that, so.
Did he ever marry?
No, he never married. His best friends were women, and they were critical in his life in many ways at different phases in his life. His 2 closest female friends was an American woman named Mary Haskell, who I quoted a little bit from. She was in Boston with him. She was about 10 years older. She eventually moved to Savannah, Georgia. That's why there is one of the largest collections, because she had a lot of his work that he had given her. and she bequeathed it to the museum there, Telfair Museum. She was his patron, and I would say his soulmate, and his editor in many ways, because you remember English wasn't his first language. So when you read the Prophet, to think that he wrote that, it's remarkable, actually, for someone with second language. And the other woman that really played a key role in his life was May Ziadeh, who was Lebanese but lived in Cairo, Egypt, and they never met. You could almost say they were soulmates, love mates, but not in a physical sense. And she played a very formative role in his life as well, in a very different way. He had some lovers, early on especially, but no, never married, never married. He did propose to Mary Haskell, and she, at one time, and she kind of held back a little bit, and then she finally came around, it seemed like, but by then he had already decided it probably wasn't wisest anyway.
He had two questions, really. Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with Carl Jung and himself? And then, in The Prophet, on page 29, that's one thing that one thing that confused me is that he says joy and sorrow are inseparable, and it seems like they're just totally the opposite, but I don't quite understand his thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure I can purport to know all his thinking either, but the first question was related to Carl Jung. Yeah. Carl Jung was just an acquaintance when Carl Jung came to the United States several times in New York. Can't say they knew each other well or anything, but he read some of Carl Jung's writings at that time. And probably, especially at the latter phase of his life, he was more influenced by some of his thinking in that regard. In terms of that, sorrow and joy, there's a wonderful line he has, is that something like, and I don't, it's this is the idea, it's that the deeper your soul is carved with hardship, the greater joy it can contain. And so there's an element where you experience greater joy having experienced deeper sorrow. So it's part of the paradox of life. Question over here.
Someone has sent in a question. Was Gibran's works not accepted by any culture, country, or religious group? Sounds like a contradictory question.
What was the question? Was it not?
Not accepted by any culture, country, or religious group.
I think it's the answer is a yes and no. It's not in the sense of viewed as a sacred text by any religious group, but at the same time its readership comes from all different religious groups. So, I mean, at the end of his life, it's said that in the hospital there at St. Joseph's in New York, the priest came to offer him last rites, and he refused. But it was almost like he was beyond that now in his own journey, you know? So one thing about Gibran, one of the reasons I wrote the book, beyond simply being taken with his own life and as what I've already shared, is that, I mean, usually I take a survey. I'm curious here, how many of you had the Prophet somehow came into your life in one way or another? Okay? Remarkable, isn't it? Now, how much did you really know about Gibran? Yeah, most don't. And so one reason was to introduce Gibran to people who actually were familiar with the name, and the second is to actually introduce him to a whole new generation, like my kids, whose worldview embodies very much of what Gibran stood for and is, but they just don't know that he exists. So that's that's why I'm going to a lot of universities and giving talks and lectures for that purpose, actually, you know, so.
From what you know of Gibran, if he was alive today, what do you think he would be doing or thinking, just from what you've studied about him?
Well, he'd be tremendously concerned about the Middle East and the conflict there. there's a wonderful little letter that I saw in the Museo Sumaya in Mexico City, where where Barbara Young, who was a woman in the latter period of his life who was a very close friend of his, writes his sister saying, and this is during World War II, "Thank God he's not alive. It would have killed him internally." Okay? So he felt things very deeply. And to see what's happened to the Levant area that he was from, I think it would be tragic. It makes the stuff that he said about Syria at his lifetime look very small, you know, in contrast. That's one thing. And the other thing, of course, if he was in our country at this time, in the U.S., I think he would, well, maybe he'd be on the list. I don't know, you know. But he certainly would be a prophetic voice speaking out against the ever-widening divides that are encouraged. So. Any other questions?
What is one phrase it touched you in the deep core of Kahlil's teachings, personally?
Personally. There's so many, of course. I love that one that I did quote about that all religions are really the fingers of the Supreme Being that longs to embrace, accept, and receive. I thought those were beautiful words, you know. And he was an optimist. And so when he looked to the transcendent, to the divine, to God, he saw a nature that, however, what term you ever want to use, but he saw a nature that was beauty, capital B. Yeah.
Well, I think we've exhausted the questions, and I think I speak for everyone that was really a beautiful presentation, and we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Maybe a hand of appreciation. And we do have a small number, not so small, but actually the book is selling very fast and very well, and it was actually quite difficult to get hold of them, the copies, but we do have a number of copies of In Search of a Prophet, and I'm sure Paul will be happy to sign them for you. So if you'd like to purchase one, they are at a reduced price. You can purchase one at the table there. And just before you go, I'd like to just make a couple of announcements. Saturday, that's this coming Saturday, David Bruce, who's the National Secretary of the Theosophical Society and on staff here, probably known to many of you who come here regularly, is quite he's quite steeped in theosophical teachings. And he's going to do an in-depth exploration of the voice of the silence. And that's Saturday afternoon from 1 to 4:30 p.m. He's actually been doing this presentation nationally, and he has done it at many lodges throughout the country, and always well received. And so we thought, well, he should do it here for the people here. So he has agreed to do that on Saturday. If you are interested, it is a theosophical classic. If you're interested in joining him on Saturday afternoon, just go to our website and you can register or just come. It starts at 1 p.m. Thursday next week, Barbara Hebert, who is the president of the Theosophical Society in America, will speak on reincarnation, ancient wisdom, modern implications. And Barbara has become national president just this year, but she has spoken here on numerous occasions, and many of you will have heard her speak. So, but if you haven't, or if you have, it doesn't matter. I invite you to come Thursday next week to hear her lecture. And also next week on Friday night, that's October the 13th, you will have an opportunity to participate in one of Yolanda Lozano's crystal bowl sound healing experiences. It's just after the full moon, and the frequency and the vibrations of the crystal bowls will help bring harmony to the etheric, emotional, and physical bodies. If you haven't experienced one of these before, next Friday is your chance. They're very, very, if nothing else, extremely relaxing, but they do facilitate a lot of healing and the sense of well-being. So that will be on Friday, October 13 at 7 p.m. If you'd like to register for that, go to our website and just go to events and you can see it there. Just register beforehand is, I think, advisable because it's cheaper. And they are all the announcements I have for you. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Please avail yourself to one of the books. Avail yourself to Paul while he's here so he can sign it for you, and stay and have some refreshments and continue the conversation. Thank you all.